Welcome to a football show, SEC Media Days wrap-up edition on this Thursday. That is Zach Lyons. I am Braden Gall, and we are, of course, brought to you by our amazing and wonderful friends, Sinkers Beverages and the Kingston Group, of course. So make sure you check out the best liquor store in the city, Sinkers Beverages, buildkg.com, of course, the Kingston Group, Bluegrass Beverages, Sinkers' sister store up in Hendersonville. Join those reward programs. I promise you, it will absolutely be worth your time. And they've got great selection. They'll help you pick out all kinds of cool stuff. We'll have some interviews for you today from across Media Days. We'll talk about the Tennessee Volunteers with Josh Ward from WNML. We'll talk about the Georgia Bulldogs, of course, number one on everybody's ballot with Seth Emerson of The Athletic. Ran into the birthday girl, of course, Caroline Fenton, now of Yahoo Sports, very near and dear to the Nashville market. Celebrated her birthday on Wednesday night doing some karaoke. So we'll hear from Caroline Fenton, some of her thoughts on the SEC. And then I wanted the national perspective of sort of the outsider's view of the SEC from a guy that I've known for a very, very long time, AP reporter. He's responsible for the top 25 that is put out by the AP. He's the one who manages it and puts it all together. Ralph Russo, he is going to give us some outsider's perspective on the SEC, the coaches, the event, the league itself. So interesting stuff from everybody today. So we'll have some reaction on that. And then, of course, I'll give you my final ballot. I would love to know what your final order of prediction would be, because one of the top discussion points here this week has been Alabama. So we'll get to all of that today on the show. Otherwise, Zach, how are you, sir? Good to see you, man.
Doing good. Didn't know Caroline was a July 17th baby. I'm a July 16th baby. So
that's right.
Back to back. What song did you sing?
No. So I had to go to bed early, so I did not sing. I don't think Caroline sang either.
Gotcha.
But T-Bob Hebert, of course, he's been on the show on Monday and played at LSU. Of course, his father, Bobby Hebert. He did Dixieland Delight, always a crowd pleaser in SEC country.
I'm sure.
There was a lot of hip hop, which is a very difficult thing to do in karaoke. I am probably very cheesy. It would be very cliche to do like Chattahoochee, Alan Jackson, Piano Man, Billy Joel. But all the music that I would want to sing would just ruin the party. You know, like you can't go up there and sing like Jason Isbell, a song I sing to my kids, which would be the one I would be best at. And no, it would just bring the whole mood of the party down.
You can't do that.
I can't do that. You got to bring the mood. You got to bring the energy up with one of those. So no, we had a great time. Happy birthday to Caroline. Happy birthday to you, of course, as well. My birthday was 10 days ago, July 7th. So happy birthday to all the July babies out there. Having a good time. So had a lot of fun. It's been a busy week. At time of taping, we've only missed two teams so far, Auburn and Kentucky. We'll finish things up, but we'll give you our predictions and stuff. But this is my favorite types of shows because there's not Titans get started next week, and we're going to have a ton of Titans content. We're going to go almost full Titans from here on out, but I wanted to wrap up SEC Media Days with our official predictions and some of the things we learned, and then some insight from some folks around the conference. But I get to let you ask the questions, which is my favorite part. So let's the floor is yours, good Zach Lyons.
Well, what's the biggest story? Earlier it was Oklahoma and Texas was the biggest story of day one. What's the biggest story throughout the week for the SEC Media Days besides Texas and Oklahoma?
So I think they're from a couple different perspectives. From the athlete's perspective, I really asked a lot of athletes, like, hey, what's the difference in the college experience from the start of your career to the end? I really wanted to hear, what an athlete has been through over the last 4 or 5 years. And I thought I would get, a lot of different answers, right? Like, oh, transferring and, time management or mental health or injuries or insurance or whatever. And every single one was NIL and video games. It was NIL and the video game. The video game came out, this week, of course. There's there's people on Radio Row that have went and bought TVs to set it up so that people could play it coming through Radio Row and do the car wash. But every player talked about NIL and how it's affected their life as an older player who didn't get it when they were younger. Now they're getting a little bit, but really they're all like, you see that 18-year-old driving that $100,000 car and you're like, really? And then, but good for you, go get that money, go get that paper. So NIL is a big one. And the video game is huge. From the coaching perspective, it was all about Nick Saban and Monte Kiffin. Nick Saban and Monte Kiffin are the two big ones. Monte Kiffin passed away last week. Lane Kiffin went on Monday. It was a very emotional experience. Everybody talking about Monte Kiffin's influence and Nick Saban's influence. So those are and then Texas and Oklahoma from the coaches. From the media perspective, And this is the part that I think is really the story. There isn't really a story. There's no news. We haven't broken any news. There's no injuries. There's no starting quarterbacks announced. No new teams have been added to the league like Texas and Oklahoma at SEC Media Days a couple years ago. I think the story is, Zach, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this. I think the story is, and I was talking with, it was like me and Chris Doring and Cole Kubelik and Andy Staples and Billy Lucci, and we're all standing around. They're all complaining about how there's nothing that's happened, and they're not wrong. And then I immediately said, the story is this is going to be the baddest ass football season we've ever seen because there are so many great quarterbacks on so many great teams. None of us can agree on who should be 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 and 8 and 9. Like, nobody can agree, but we all agree that there's like 8 teams that could make the SEC championship game against Georgia. and so like like the story is we have a 12-team playoff for the first time, no divisions for the first time, Texas and Oklahoma for the first time, great quarterbacks for the first time, a new coach at Alabama without Nick Saban for the first time in almost 2 decades, and no one has an effing clue how the top 7 or 8 or 9 teams are going to fill out. There's 3 more good teams behind them, Kentucky, Auburn, and Florida. It is unprecedented, the season we're about to have. And I think the story is how good the football is going to be in this league. And it is. I am super excited about it, and I'm kind of bummed that there's like a 5-week break between now and the season.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because I think the main storyline, or one of our main talking points on this show last year, was how great the quarterbacks were in the SEC, and how really after Georgia, it was kind of the same thing as like, we know that's probably Georgia and Alabama, kind of like you probably know that's Georgia and Texas, but you really don't know if Alabama is the second best team. Really, like, we really don't know if Texas is the second best team, that in my mind. But that's what makes it great. And last year we headed into what we thought was going to be the most exciting SEC football season we've seen. It kind of was a little bit of a letdown, but now this one is like, hold my beer. Here we go. Get ready, buckle up, because you still have great quarterbacks playing. You have Nico, UT on the periphery. You have Missouri with, the success that they had last year. But all these quarterbacks, like you said, are just as good and deep and just as deep as what it was last year, even though it's almost entirely new faces for the SEC besides maybe Jalen Milroe and a couple of other guys. And you're right. That is the story, right? Is because we kind of talked about it on Monday. Is like, can anybody agree on the top 5? I mean, yep. I felt like it was probably a little bit more is easier to do last year than it is this year, because it is everybody's taking a step up. And once again, the SEC is still the best conference in sports.
Yeah, and I think if you told me LSU, Tennessee, Missouri, Texas A&M, Oklahoma are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which is very possible. There's no other conference in America where those like the 9th, 8th, 7th place teams are potential 9 or 10 win teams. Like, there's just that. Like, the Big Ten has a really good top 4, right? Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, Penn State. It's really good. USC might be good, but they're like not the same. ACC's got 2, maybe 3 teams at the top: Florida State, Clemson, but none of them are top 10. Nobody close to Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Alabama, Ole Miss. And the Big 12's got nobody in the top 10. The difference between this league and everybody else is how good these teams are. There is Tennessee could be 7th in the rankings when the predictions come out, and they could be a 10-2 playoff team. And there's no other conference where the 7th or 8th place team thinks that they can make the playoff. And to your point about the quarterbacks, Brady Cook wasn't a star going into last year. He is now one of the big stars in this conference. He and Luther Burden, that offense from Missouri is going to be insanely good. Nico, and to your point, they've got established guys now. Jackson Dart, Brady Cook, Carson Beck, Jalen Milroe, right? Quinn Ewers is now in the conference. That's 5 established starters that are very good. But it's not just that. It's Oklahoma brought Jackson Arnold to this event. He's started 1 bowl game. They clearly have faith in him. They let Dylan Gabriel walk. He's the highest rated quarterback, I think, in the EA Sports video game. They let him leave to go to Oregon because they're like, no, we got this Jackson Arnold guy. Garrett Nussmeier, Jaden Daniels won the Heisman, and they brought Garrett Nussmeier to SEC Media Days at LSU because they're that confident in his abilities. And that doesn't even include Nico. And Connor Wigman at A&M didn't get brought here either. But the new names are going to also break out, as well as the established names. And they're all the best teams. Graham Mertz was here, one of the better quarterbacks in the country. That's a 10th or an 11th place Florida team. Peyton Thorne is in his second season starting for Auburn. Not a great season, but I think he's going to be better this year. And then you got all the other names down at the bottom, like that are a lot of them are transfers. Brock Vandegrift at Kentucky, Diego Pavia at Vanderbilt, Blake Shapen at Mississippi State. You got Taylor Green at Arkansas. Lenore Sellers probably going to start for South Carolina, kind of a Cam Newton clone. I just think you could sit, you and I did this all week with folks, because you asked on Monday sort of like, hey, what would change your mind? And a lot of it's conversations with players and coaches and media members and experts. It's just people you trust off the record, a lot of it. And like, I'm not kidding, Zach. I had at least 2 people convince me, or like in a conversation, not like attempting to convince me, but like made really good points for every single team that we're going to talk about. Like I had 2, and you'll hear this from Caroline and Ralph. Like they both really like LSU. Like Ralph really likes LSU. And like some people really like Tennessee. Some people really like Missouri. Everybody likes Alabama, Texas, and Ole Miss. Like A&M has moved up my board this week. Like it's just that you can make the case for so many good teams, and it's unprecedented. We're Tennessee, Ole Miss, and Missouri. This is like the line that I used all week, and people's always were like, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that." Tennessee, and I think I've said it on this show. Tennessee, Missouri, and Ole Miss could all finish 10-2 and not have played each other. And that's an unprecedented situation in the SEC. So everything is just new. That should be exciting. I think it's going to make for great football. The margins of error are extremely, extremely small. Tennessee loses at Oklahoma. That could change both seasons. Missouri loses at A&M. That changes both seasons. One team can make the playoff. One team's out. Like the margins are small. The talent is great. The depth is extraordinary. And the structure is all brand new. Like that. Sorry, but that's good for people like us who make content.
It's must-see TV.
It is chaos every Saturday, and it is going to be absolutely awesome. And I think that's kind of the story. I said that in that group, and they all kind of stopped, and they were like, I can't wait for the season. You're right. That is the story. Like that's the story, is that we are in for something we've never seen before. And I'm ready to go, man. I'm fired up after being here all week. I'm ready. I'm ready to get home. but so is my digestive tract. But I'm ready to get home. But I'm ready for ball, man. It's gonna be a lot of fun. I'm ready for Titans camp. I can't wait. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
Well, we got over 20 minutes of video from your 4 different interviews, so let's go ahead and kick that off. We'll start off with Josh Ward of WNML of Knoxville talking about the Tennessee Volunteers.
All right, Josh, you had a chance to talk to everybody from Tennessee, obviously. How different do you think they are as a group? Josh, Coach Heupel, and the players, like, do they feel different to you coming into this event this year than previous years?
Yes, I think there's a lot of comfort because they believe at least that they're going to have a lot of success and probably expect to have a lot of success. And a few years ago, it was more about, okay, what's the program going to become? They weren't in a very good position. They had to find out if they could win. And now they know that they're capable of doing that going in. They also have Amari Thomas, who's been here, so he's comfortable in the setting talking about Tennessee. Cooper Mays, who this time a year ago planned to be in the NFL, and now he's back for another season, his final year at Tennessee. He used that extra eligibility. It's just an older group, and I think Josh Heupel also is comfortable with where the program is. He's not hiding from the idea that they have a ton of talent, they have depth, and with that, big expectations. So the talk, at least, I think, is real in terms of what they expect of themselves.
What's interesting is all the players today basically were okay being the underdog. And I think Tennessee, like a few other teams in the league, is probably comfortable not being the team picked and not having all the headlines. I wonder if that's part of the strategy of not bringing Nico Iamaleava to the event, actually.
Yeah, I think letting the older guys kind of handle that, I think that's part of it. If Nico has the success he's expected to this year, he'll be here next year. James Pierce Jr., he's another guy with all the SEC and national accolades, but not in the position where they want him representing what the message is. He's not as good media-wise. He's great on the field media-wise. They'll go with the veterans, the guys that have been in the program 5+ years, or Keenan, who's been in college for 8 or 9 years. So I think that's a big part of the message, but Tennessee looks at itself as a team that belongs with the best teams in the league, but Georgia, Texas, they've proven what they can do. Alabama's a new coach, but the program has been there. Tennessee's trying to get back there, but they believe that they're at least 20-22 good, meaning they can go win 10 games, they can put up one of the best offenses in the country. They have to go prove it, but the belief is real.
Is the analysis of the team pretty accurate? Like, elite defensive line, pretty solid along the offensive line, great quarterback-friendly system, questions in the back seven in the secondary, and that if the quarterback develops into a star, they're very, very good. Is that as clean, as simple as it can get with Tennessee?
Yeah, I think most people share the same opinion looking at the personnel of what it is, what it can be. There are a couple of groups that it might go one way or the other. Like, some have more confidence in the wide receiver group than others. On our show, Jason Swain, a former wide receiver, maybe that's part of it. He wants to see more of the potential, the way it's being talked about, actually happen on the field. But Josh Heupel himself has said, yeah, last year we lacked depth, especially after Brew McCoy went down with injury. He's right about that. Go back and watch some of the play calling. It shows you what he thought of some of the personnel, the protection that might have been lacking at times from the offensive line, and the lack of playmaking at wide receiver. I think he'll show us with what he calls the confidence he has in the quarterback, the protection. Again, that has to be shown. Lance Hurd's a big factor at left tackle, but then the wide receivers. There should be more playmaking with a guy like Chris Brazell, but to the offensive line overall, yeah, they bring back some veterans. That shows you, if Cooper Mays is healthy, what they're probably capable of. The defensive line, I think, is legit with Pierce and his elite ability, and then the depth, the amount of guys they'll play. The secondary, nobody knows. Nobody knows because it's a brand new group. We know they're talented, but they've never played in the SEC. Any of them really playing meaningful snaps. So they have to go prove it. And then linebacker, everybody agrees they have some talent. I think most everybody agrees they better not have any injuries.
Yep. All right, so is Tennessee clear? Like, are they capable of being the best team on the second tier? Does that make sense? If you're going to put Georgia and Texas and Alabama, maybe Ole Miss, I don't know who you got on your top tier, but is Tennessee capable of being the fourth or fifth team, the top of that second tier, and then ultimately that gets them into the playoff?
Yeah, I think so. And there can be the question of how many SEC teams can get in. We're all curious with a 12-team playoff. Ole Miss I put in the knocking on the door of the top tier category because they brought in real transfer talent. So let's see how it comes together. But yeah, their potential is tier one potential. But in the Missouri, LSU, Tennessee, and then A&M, Auburn, they all want to be part of that conversation. Tennessee has as much to feel good about because if they can be good to really good, in some areas great along the line of scrimmage, and if their quarterback has great potential, which he has, then if they tap into that and they can stay relatively healthy, nothing's guaranteed in football, but if it works out the way that they need it to, then they can be a playoff team this year because they can win in Norman if they're ready. If their defensive line can win the battles against Oklahoma's offensive line, then they can win the game. And if they beat NC State and Oklahoma and they're 4-0 at the end of September, they are a very real playoff contender. And nationally, they'll be talked about that way entering October.
Thanks, man. Thanks, Josh.
Okay.
Josh Ward there, WNML. What do you think, Zach? You follow? Do you agree with where the analysis kind of went there?
Yeah, I think so. It sounds like it's a lot of expectations and belief in themselves. And I do kind of like their talent and depth, but it all really hinges on what the offense can do. And, you know, for most SEC teams, it's kind of like, well, if the defense can do this, the defense can do that. With the cornerback situation that they have over at University of Tennessee, it's just kind of like, it's really about the offense for this team because, like y'all said, they have a good defensive line. They could generate a pass rush, which may help their corners a little bit. But I don't know if I'm just as sold on this wide receiver group as everybody else is. I'm not really sold on Squirrel White, Brew McCoy. What can he be? Can he stay healthy? Like if Brew McCoy goes down, it feels like it may just be the same as last year. Like I understand.
Well, the transfer Brazel is the one that's getting all the love and the hype, and that he might be he might be the difference, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and he may be the difference, but again, he caught 44 passes I think last year for 711 yards if I'm right on that, and 5 touchdowns. So like, and sure, that's as a redshirt freshman, so that's pretty good, and it is Tulane. but again, it's like a lot of faith is being put into Chris Brazzell, and I'm not as sold on the wide receivers. I'm not sold on the quarterback yet, and I think I agree more with Jason Swain, which is what he said. Like, I want to see it on the field.
I agree.
And at the end of the day, I think that's kind of where I think it's okay to have expectations of success. I think it's okay if you want to put them as the like you put it, as like the top team in the second tier. But it is a lot of wait and see. It's kind of like the Tennessee Titans, which is, it's kind of like we got to see it on the field. We got to see it to believe it.
I think I think there is questions about the receiving core, less so about the receivers in the secondary and depth at linebacker. That the back seven is my biggest concern. But I think some of the reason for optimism, if you're going to make that argument for the receiving core, is that some of the issues last year, while the receivers were not good, and without McCoy, they certainly weren't good, a big part of the problem was Joe Milton. There were guys that were open, and even if you're just 5 to 6% more efficient from a completion percentage standpoint, or even just like a yard more accurate, which we all believe that Nico Iamaleava will be, that can kind of make up some of maybe the questions around the receiving core. But I agree with you and Swain. I think we need to see it. I just think I trust the system. I trust the quarterback to sort of figure that stuff out. You can't say that about the secondary and the linebackers. Like, that just has to be good. The way the defensive line is loaded, that will help the secondary. The schedule helps as well. I mean, going up against an Oklahoma team that has a completely rebuilt offensive line and a quarterback who's new, even if they're very talented, that's sort of like a weakness on weakness, right? And a strength on weakness at the same time. I do think that Tennessee is not on my top tier. We'll get to predictions in a second, but Tennessee's not on my top tier. I think they are in a battle with 3 or 4 teams for the final playoff spot. That's how I would look at it, is that there's 3 teams that I think are going to make the playoff, and I feel comfortable about that top tier. Get to that in a second. But I think there's 4 teams on the next tier battling for maybe 1 or 2, maybe 2 spots, probably 1 spot. And
what do you think the floor in wins for Tennessee is?
I think it's pretty high. I think it's like 8 minimum.
Because that's why I was thinking, like, worst case scenario, this is an 8-win team. Best case scenario, this is a 10-win team, right? Like,
yeah, like,
or is the absolute best case that they go 11-1? Like, what are your thoughts?
I think 11-1 would be best case. Lost to Georgia, beat Alabama at home, because I think they can beat Alabama. But this is back to my margin for error comment just a second ago. Every team has to be almost perfect, and we just know that's not going to happen. Like, there's
especially
too many
with the secondary, right? And the depth at linebacker is like, it's kind of hard for this Tennessee team to be absolutely perfect. But there is a lot of, it's almost like, again, it's like you're not really, you are trying to win, you are trying to compete, but this is really more about next year than it is this year, right? Like, for the Tennessee team, kind of like the Tennessee Titans.
That's kind of true in a sense, but also they're like the veterans in their final year. Amari Thomas, James Pierce, Cooper Mays, like, those are all line of scrimmage dominant pieces. They're all gone. Dylan Sampson's gone next year. There is a little bit of urgency to capitalize on the surrounding cast with Nico this year. The surrounding cast next year around Nico is probably not as good. Still very good. Still good. But there's I think there's pressure this year. I think the key is, like, we just got done saying, the depth in this conference is extraordinary. There's so many good teams, 10, 11, 12. Well, Tennessee's going to play Kentucky, and they're going to play Florida. Who's to say they win both of those games? So, like, it's just, there's trap games everywhere for everyone. And we can point to the biggest ones for Tennessee: Oklahoma, Bama, Georgia. You have to win at least one of those 3 to get to 10-2. But then you also have to be perfect against NC State, Arkansas on the road, Florida at home, Kentucky. They should win those games. But should and don't always line up in college football or in any sport. And so I think that's why I am not putting them into the playoff, and I'm not putting them into the top tier, because I just think there's just enough weakness to cost them 1 game somewhere. And that 1 game, that 1 drive, I can say this about every team: Missouri, Ole Miss, LSU, A&M. There's going to be a drive that costs maybe 1, maybe 2 teams a playoff spot. That is the margin for error in the SEC this year. So,
just a side question. Go ahead. Side question. Cooper Mays coming back. Does that say a lot about what the NFL thinks of Cooper Mays? Because, you get these reports, right? I mean, like, he's not maybe he got reports that, or profiles back or information back that he was a 4th round pick. And maybe he thinks that he can maybe improve it to a 2nd or 3rd. I mean, do you think that's the case? I mean, why come back?
I think it would be hard to say broadly any reason can be applied to everybody. Like Graham Mertz decided to come back because the offense stayed intact, and players come back. Like Malachi Moore came back to Alabama because of they are, and we'll get to this in a second, but like Alabama is motivated. Like they are, because they lost players when Saban left. Like the people that came back and stuck it out, like they feel even tighter. Because it's like, no, we stuck it out through the changes of the coach and through the law. Like, they were still a drive away from playing for the national championship. Like, let's just not lie about Alabama being the defending SEC champion, by the way. So I think it's hard to say anyone. I mean, that certainly could be possible. I don't know if he's that highly valued, to be honest. If I had to guess, I think he's more of like a mid to late round pick, but that absolutely could be part of it. And hey, I want to play with Nico. I've got unfinished business. I want to get back to the way it was 2 years ago. He was hurt for the Florida game. It cost him last year. He didn't play in that game. So it's hard to evaluate any one player in that situation. So
it's just a little curious.
No, it's an interesting question. All right. So the team that has the fewest questions, other than, and maybe the tiniest little bit of news, which is that Kirby Smart sort of admitted in a private setting with private reporters that the speeding stuff, because there's more incidents right now in Athens and Georgia. This is not the biggest story with Georgia, but more incidents. And I will say this, I talked to a few people off the record. This is not just a concern at Georgia. There are other teams that are dealing with this more than people realize.
You give kids fast cars, they make fast mistakes.
You cannot give
who really threw his team under the bus. Says, "Well, I'm just not a fucking idiot." Is pretty much what he said.
You cannot give a 19-year-old 500 horsepower and expect him to go 45 miles an hour. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But he said what they're doing is they're fining him. Now there's some debate about whether that's a fine, and Seth's going to talk about this. Are you withholding NIL money or are you fining them? That's two. There's a subtle difference there, but instead of suspending players, they're taking their money away, which is what the NFL does. So very, very interesting sort of what's happening. Kirby kind of admitted that. Seth's going to talk about that. Seth Emerson from The Athletic. He's covered the Georgia Bulldogs for a very, very long time, has great insight into the program. Here was my conversation real quick here with Seth Emerson of The Athletic.
All right, Seth, let's start with Kirby Smart and the off-the-field stuff. He was asked about it. It sounds like he's making a different change, though, from a fine standpoint. Is that correct? Explain sort of his thinking on handling some of the stuff that's happening outside of the program.
So he says it's been happening for more than a year. They just haven't publicized it. That guys that get in trouble, he didn't specify whether it was just speeding tickets or if it has to be an arrest or whatever, but he said that the collective is taking money away from them. And he also didn't specify whether it's a fine or whether it's withholding the next one. I've heard, before he said this today, I had heard from somebody that was withholding payment. There's also questions about, how does that involve the contract for the NIL collective, et cetera. I don't know, but he's conveying the point that they are doing something, and they're also, they've been suspending guys, and they're going to suspend some of these players that have been arrested this offseason. He's just not publicizing it yet. And he defends that by saying he doesn't think that they should be further embarrassed. I don't know about that. I think if they're going to be suspended, I would announce it, because I think it's important to send a PR message, to people like me who are also driving around Athens, that you are trying to do something about this. But he did today come with an awareness that he needs to continue to address this publicly, and it's the only way it's going to go away is when these things stop happening.
Yeah. So Saban's on set. Obviously, he has a really deep relationship with Kirby. Lane Kiffin on Monday, pretty emotional after the passing of his father, and his relationship with Nick Saban. Do you feel like Kirby has evolved, changed? Maturing is not the right word, but do you feel like there's a different type of Kirby? He was very sort of introspective about his age today. What is your perspective on Kirby's evolution?
I think he's largely the same. He's the same guy. He was asked today, one of our about you're 48, you're still relatively young, but you've won 2 championships. And he's like, I wasn't in this to chase championships. And whether you believe that or not, like, that's the Nick Saban mentality. That's like, it was the Mike Krzyzewski mentality, the Bill Belichick mentality, that it's about the process. And I think that part is the same guy. I think everything else is kind of just naturally being older and just kind of evolving as a person as you naturally would if Kirby was not a football coach. He'd be working for a Fortune 500 company and probably be fairly high up. He just would be naturally aging and maturing the way he is. But I think he's also becoming more comfortable with kind of being the guy in college football now that Saban is not the guy anymore. That I think Kirby kind of understands that he's that guy right now, but he also understands that he will only remain that guy if his team continues to not necessarily win the championship every year, but be one of the main teams in contention. So he wants to do everything he can to keep their spot.
They're going to be picked to win the conference. They're probably preseason number 1 by most polls. Maybe there's another team in there, Ohio State. But
right.
If you look around this league, what teams have some of the attributes that you would think are capable of challenging Georgia? Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, it depends on how much has Alabama changed under Kalen DeBoer. They may have lost a lot of talent when DeBoer came in. He's doing a good job recruiting so far. But there's a lot of those players on that Alabama team that beat Georgia last December. And, Kalen DeBoer has shown that he's a good coach. So Georgia may have more talent than Alabama right now, but that game's in Tuscaloosa. Kalen DeBoer is a good coach. That's going to be fascinating to see that transition. Texas is a talented team. That game's in Texas. Ole Miss, that game's in Ole Miss. And, look, Georgia, I mean, I guess I can imagine them going 12-0, but I definitely wouldn't bet on it. And 11-1 with that schedule would be really good. And 10-2 will almost certainly get them in the playoff. So with Georgia's schedule, it's also just going to be a matter of, can they do it every week? Because there's so many more pitfalls potentially on this year's schedule than there were last year. I mean, last year they didn't have a real game until the Auburn game, and that was in week 5, and that wasn't supposed to be a real game. This year they start right off with Clemson, and then they've got a trip to Kentucky in a couple weeks. And then a couple weeks after that is Alabama, and then Texas in October, and Ole Miss in November. And, they're going to have to bring it every week. And I'm not sure. There's people that say 9-3, that gets you in the playoffs. Like, I don't know. I think the playoffs can be harder to get into than people imagine. I think Georgia's going to, it's going to be. I would still pick Georgia to make the playoff, but I don't know that I would pick them first tomorrow, because of the schedule. I think
that's that he had some interesting stuff. I guess let's start with what he ended with is the 3 hardest games on their schedule are also all 3 away games. And he's like, I wouldn't bet on 12-0, and I don't think he would bet on 11-1. By the way, his face contorted and his tone. And I think that's very interesting. He's even kind of like putting a little doubt that maybe he won't put Georgia number 1 because of the schedule. So, I mean, I think we all know that Georgia's probably the most talented team, right? He even says that they're the most talented team, but there's something to say about the schedule. How much are we underrating the schedule for Georgia?
I think here it's been properly rated as very difficult. I think they are also properly rated as the best team. What is fascinating about the 12-team playoff and the depth that we've been talking about all show is I think I can more accurately predict the playoff than I can the SEC champion. I would not be surprised if it was Texas and Ole Miss in the SEC championship game. I would not be surprised if it was Alabama, Tennessee. I would not be surprised if it was Georgia versus anyone. I wouldn't be surprised if LSU and Missouri played in the SEC championship game. There's any combination is possible, because there's a very good chance we have like 6 10-2 teams. And then all these weird-ass tiebreakers. Georgia has to play Clemson as well, which is a preseason favorite to make the ACC championship game in week 1. I think Georgia wins that game, but like their schedule is very hard. And Oklahoma's schedule is very hard. What makes Missouri and Ole Miss interesting is their schedules are quote-unquote easier. Texas and LSU kind of have some breaks. Tennessee kind of has some breaks. Here, like, I'm picking Georgia to play in the SEC championship game based on like power rankings. But I don't feel comfortable, like Seth, saying they're clearly going to be there and clearly going to make it there, because they could miss the SEC title game based on a tiebreaker or a technicality. And if that happens,
like the last few years when you would be pretty safe to bet, like you could bet your mortgage that Georgia would at least make it to the championship game.
Yeah, and he said it. Last year's schedule, I mean, while it's tough for the average college football team, it's easy for Georgia. This year, it's tough for anyone that's ever put on a uniform. Like, it is really hard. I mean,
and they struggled out of the gate, started slow in a lot of those easy layup games.
Alabama, Texas, and Ole Miss, all on the road, all preseason top 5 teams or top 6 teams. Yeah. Like, that's insane. And that doesn't include hosting Tennessee. It doesn't include, there's a lot of other games on there. But I think if you get them into a 12-team playoff, I'm not sure who beats them other than maybe Ohio State. So that's what's weird. Like, on the road in the SEC is different than a neutral site with the playoff on the line. Like, they're just different. And that's the way the NFL is. Everybody can beat everybody in the NFL in the regular season. 12-0 can lose to 0-12. That's just the way it works. But you get into the playoffs and things are different. It's win or go home. It's only the best teams. You're playing for a chance to go to the Super Bowl. Like, it's just a little bit different. And I think in college it's even more amplified. So it's weird to say that I think Georgia has a better chance to win the national title than the SEC, which is so weird. But I think it's easier to predict them as a playoff team making a deep run, because if they get there, it's the same thing with Alabama. If Alabama gets to the playoff, I'm picking them to go pretty far. But I have no clue if Alabama can get to the SEC championship game. So it's just such a weird year, and it goes back to our first point, which is it's going to be absolutely, absolutely special. But Georgia, best quarterback, probably in the country, maybe. Best offensive line in the country. Best coaching staff in the country. Best roster in the country. Best secondary probably in the country. I mean, maybe the best running back in the conference, and Trevor Etienne. I mean, they're the best. Doesn't mean they're going to finish with the best record, but they are the best. So,
well, I think another point that he was talking about was that I liked and I wrote down was calling Kirby Smart the guy, because I think that was something that we've talked about a few different times. Like, who's now the personality of the NCAA? Like, Saban's gone, Harbaugh's gone. Is it? I mean, maybe it's Ryan Day, you could argue, but it really seems like Kirby Smart's the guy, because he's the guy that usually has his team in that top 4 somewhere every year in and year out. And he's not really a personality guy. Like, you don't really hear much from Kirby Smart on hot topics and everything like that. No. Like NIL and all this kind of stuff, throwing his opinions out there and they're making headlines like Saban or Harbaugh. But it's kind of like he said a lot of stuff about Kirby Smart that you could say about Nick Saban that you have said on this show about Nick Saban, particularly like if he was a CEO in a business, or if he was working in a business in a mailroom, he'd be CEO at some point. And that's how you kind of describe Nick Saban. That's how he described Kirby Smart. So my question to you is, Kirby Smart just turning into Nick Saban at this point?
I mean, he
evolving into Nick Saban.
I mean, I think he said it, like, he learned everything he knows about football from Nick Saban coaching for him for like 9 years. I mean, so I think there's 2 people that are filling the void, and it's actually pretty analogous to Saban and Harbaugh. Saban was the best because he was the best program, best coach, most championships, most wins, ran the best program, was the best coach. That's Kirby Smart right now. He's the best coach on the best program, running the best thing, winning the championships, favored for all this stuff. They're the best. Harbaugh was the guy who hadn't really won it yet, but had this big personality, a little quirky, a little weird, and took up a lot of oxygen because he was a personality, a cult, a brand. That's Lane Kiffin. So the 2 people that are filling the void.
It's interesting.
The 2 people that are filling the void of sort of interest and gravitational force, like Nick Saban was a planet, and Jim Harbaugh was a planet. Those were like from an interest and attention standpoint. And I think the 2 guys that have filled that void, the vacuum, are Kirby Smart and Lane Kiffin for all the appropriate reasons. And Kiffin they were both a little bit more introspective about sort of who they are and their place in the game this week. And I think that's new for Lane Kiffin, certainly. And I think Kirby Smart has no choice. Like, he's the best coach on the best team. You learn from Nick Saban. You're Nick Saban Jr. Like, you have no choice but to sort of become that thing in college football. And I think, again, I mean, they're the best program. So, like, he already kind of is Nick Saban. He just has to – he's just learning how to kind of like, oh, this is who I am now. And I think Lane showed a lot of, like, emotion and maturity and introspection this week that he doesn't normally show. And I think Harbaugh sort of evolved that same way, right? He was goofy as hell when he got to Michigan, and he kind of stopped some of that stuff and evolved and got kind of smarter and built the program in a different way, ended up in a championship. Is that going to happen with Lane? I don't know. They got a hell of a team this year, so we shall see. All right. I ran into our good friend, Nashville media member Caroline Fenton, no longer. She's, of course, at Yahoo Sports, and had a chance to talk to her about all kinds of fun stuff, but you guys know and love her. So I figured, you know what? We got to put Caroline on the show. It's her birthday. We got to have fun with her. So here was my conversation. Obviously, a lot of stuff with LSU. We got Texas, Oklahoma in there. So here was my conversation with Yahoo Sports, Caroline Fenton.
Caroline, good to see you. First of all, tell everybody the new role and where everybody can find you.
Yeah, so I'm working for Yahoo Sports. I'll be a college football host, so you can find me yahoosports.com. You can find me Yahoo Sports Socials on YouTube. I'll be doing twice a week live streams during the college football season on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and a daily podcast. So really excited for the new role.
All right, well, there you go. All right, so narratives are the name of the game at SEC Media Days. We all have opinions. We all are talking season here. We're going to have predictions as well. What is the thing that we're getting wrong? We always get stuff wrong, so what are we wrong about?
We are always getting stuff wrong, and I feel like in July we always feel like we have things figured out. I think one thing that we could be getting wrong is either Auburn or Florida. I don't think we're underestimating both of them. I don't think that both of them are going to be a potential 8 or 9 win team, but one of them. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. We're underestimating Graham Mertz. He was the most efficient passer in the SEC last year. I also think we're looking at Florida's schedule and the outcome of last season, and we're just kind of laughing them off like they'll be another 5-win football team. I think that's one part of being a young team one year, which Florida was last year. Okay, now those players are another year older. Now those players have even more experience, and Graham Mertz is acclimated into Billy Napier's offense. I also look at Auburn, and I think that Auburn, with the talent that they brought in the wide receiver position, they were the worst passing team in the SEC last year. I don't expect that to be the same case this year. So I think both of those could be a dark horse contender. We're just kind of overlooking.
Who's on the top tier? I'm assuming Georgia will be one of the 2 teams you put in the championship game. Who's on the top tier when you consider your ballot? Who are the other teams you're going to put there with Georgia that you're thinking about?
So it'll be Georgia, Texas for the quarterback of it all. Quinn Ewers comes back year 3. It's not going to be easy to replace Devondre Sweat and Byron Murphy. It's not going to be easy to replace A.D. Mitchell and Xavier Worthy, but Texas has done some work in the transfer portal. I would put Texas in the mix. I also have to put Alabama in the mix. It's not the same Nick Saban benefit of the doubt where we all say, okay, well, Alabama's automatically going to be a 10-win team. I think that Jalen Milroe coming into year 2, and in this Kalen DeBoer offense, look at what Kalen DeBoer did with Michael Penix Jr. Very similar skill set to Jalen Milroe. He's incredibly athletic. He has an absolute cannon. He was able to kind of gear Michael Penix into his strengths. I think that Jalen Milroe in Alabama, with the schedule that they have, it's not a cakewalk, but it's also not a murderer's row. I'm going to put Alabama right up there with Texas and Georgia in my top 3.
All right, there's a really healthy next group, like Ole Miss, Missouri, Tennessee, LSU, maybe A&M and Oklahoma, but those top 4 are for sure going to be very good, mostly because of quarterbacks, offensive systems. Who do you like the most of that group? Who do you like the least? Again, Tennessee, Nico, you got Brady Cook, Jackson Arnold, the whole deal. Like, what's the team that you like the most out of that group, and maybe who's overrated?
Of the group of LSU, Tennessee, Ole Miss, and Missouri, I'm going to say I like Missouri the best out of that group. And yes, we saw Brady Cook do what he did last year, but it's really about Luther Burden for me. Luther Burden is not getting talked about enough. I think he's the best wide receiver in the sport this year. What worries me about Missouri is 2 things. Losing Cody Schrader, but also Missouri is going to, I think, adopt more of a running back by committee philosophy this year, and also the defense. You don't lose Blake Baker and defensive line coach Kevin Peoples, who are now at LSU, and get better. So I'm a little bit worried about Missouri's defense, but so much returning talent on that team. I think Missouri is going to be a team that could find itself in the college football playoff. And the group that I like the least, honestly, I have to go with LSU. Kyron Lacey is going to be a star. He's a name that I don't think a lot of people know now, but will. But I think outside of Kyron Lacey at the wide receiver position, who else is going to be a threat for Garrett Nussmeier? And also, while the defensive coaching staff is upgraded, I mentioned Kevin Peoples and Blake Baker, Bo Davis in the mix coaching the defensive line. I don't know if the talent is there. There's just not enough experience on the defensive side of the ball. I think LSU could be a team that disappoints.
So you're going Georgia, Texas on your ballot this week?
Georgia, Texas on my ballot this week, which is so not fun. So if I want to throw a fun potential matchup in there,
Missouri,
I'm going to throw Georgia, Missouri in there. If it's anybody that I don't think would find their way in Atlanta, it'd be Texas.
There you have it, Caroline Fenton. Happy birthday, Caroline, by the way. I do appreciate you coming on. I have a lot to say. She likes Missouri. She's down with LSU. I have a lot to say about this group, but I want to give you my predictions on that. So I want to kind of hold off on that because I think there's some tiers here that we've already discussed on the show, and I've finalized my order here. So I don't know what do you react to, and what did you hear there that you liked?
Well, we talked about thin margins, right? And maybe two teams that you don't want to see on the schedule, or maybe you think are easy wins on the schedule, but could be the spoilers for some of these other higher ranked teams in Florida and Auburn. I think that was a unique prediction, and something that we keep saying thin margins, right? Well, thin margins also include teams like Florida and Auburn, who are young teams or who had new coaches or new systems or stuff like that. Now they're another year older into that system. Thin margins includes those teams. It includes University of Tennessee, losing to one of these guys. It includes maybe Georgia, barely beating one of these teams, which when you get to the committee and you're talking about who's in the playoffs and you're talking about wins and losses and all this stuff, that's something that kind of factors into, well, if you got 10-2 Georgia and 10-2, Ohio State, but they, the two losses are the same. Well, they barely beat Florida. That could be something that comes up. I just using Georgia and Florida. I don't even know. I'm assuming they play.
Missouri, yeah, they do. Missouri's a good example of this. They sort of get some quote unquote schedule breaks, but so they're not going to get any. They don't have a big non-conference game on their schedule to pad their resume. So if they're 10-2, and the committee's looking at like 10-2 Tennessee and 10-2 Missouri, the difference could be that well, they both play Oklahoma. Let's say they both beat Oklahoma. They both play Alabama, and they both lose to Alabama. Well, Tennessee will have a win maybe over a top 25 NC State team in the non-conference. And that could be the margin that gets Tennessee into the playoff that leaves Missouri out because they don't play as quote-unquote tough of a schedule. And I completely agree with you. One of my takes and one of my questions I've asked everybody this week, Auburn, Florida, Kentucky, I all think are better than people will think 10, 11, and 12. One of them is going to pop. One of them is going to be like an 8 or 9 win team, like she said. And I completely agree. I personally lean towards Florida, but I think absolutely one of those three is going to pop. And it could be Auburn. Kentucky has a much tougher schedule, but that trio, to your point, is going to play a major role in the outcomes of the conference for sure, because they're going to win some games.
Like, it's not like they're going to be real big. I don't think any of them are going to be like college football playoff contenders, but they're going to be college football playoff spoilers. Like, that's really what they are. Is like Florida, Auburn is like, they're not Vanderbilt. They're not South Carolina. They're not those teams that you put. They're considered pushovers probably by most of the other. You hook them up to a lie detector, most SEC teams are probably going to call Vanderbilt a pushover, right? They're not those teams where they may have been a little bit last year.
Florida will play A&M early in the season at home before A&M sort of maybe figures out who they are. I think A&M is going to be very good by the end of the year. But if Florida wins that game, that could be the thing that keeps A&M out of a conversation. And then late in the year, Florida's going to host LSU and Ole Miss in back-to-back weeks. They could easily win one of those games, and that loss could be the thing that knocks out LSU or Ole Miss from the playoff. Like, this is where we are with this season. It's going to be It's going to be absolutely spectacular. So I don't want to go any further on this because there's so many. I want to get my full predictions out here, and I want to make sure we keep to time and pay attention to the length here. So let's hear from Ralph Russo, Associated Press. He is the guy who does the poll. So when the AP poll comes out, he is the person who has conducted it, who goes and gets all the votes, tallies it all up, and produces it and writes it. I've known him for a very, very long time. Huge Mets fan. Go Mets, of course. And really smart dude. Has been around this league and other leagues, covers the entire sport nationally. But he has some interesting perspective on the conference. So we talked about teams he likes, teams he doesn't like, and of course, a little bit about the difference between the SEC and some other conferences. Here is my conversation with the AP's Ralph Russo.
All right, Ralph, good to see you, man. Thanks for coming on. All right, the media is wrong about a lot of things all the time. We come to these events, narratives are created. I'd like you to give me a guess at what you think we are wrong about this year in the SEC.
Oh, okay. No, I think I got a good one because I've been workshopping this take for a while. I think that we are underrating LSU. I think that we have been kind of on a wrong streak with LSU the last few years. I think that they set some higher, they were perceived as exceeding expectations in year one, right? Because they beat Alabama. And then it sets them up for very high expectations that they weren't ready for in year two under Brian Kelly. So now I think that after 3 pretty good years of recruiting, 3 straight top 10 classes, when Kelly says, hey, we have a deeper team, I kind of believe him. And I believe his idea of, hey, you can't be patching holes in the portal. You need to sort of use that as topping off the tank, as he put it. And I think LSU's in better position. So I think the thing that we're going to be wrong about is the difference between LSU and Ole Miss. Ole Miss is the team with a lot of hype, the great transfer portal class. My sense is October 12th, those two teams meet in Baton Rouge. That's probably a swing game that sends the winner off to playoff contention while the loser has to regroup.
Do you think those two teams are competing for a spot in the SEC championship game on that level of a tier? Or do you think it's more, like you said, like maybe they're 3, 4, 5 and they're competing for a playoff spot?
So I was talking about this with Cole Kublik and Greg McElroy. Greg seems to think there are 9 teams that can play in the SEC championship game. And, that might be a little bit of a stretch, but I don't think you're making huge jumps to come up with about 8 or 9 teams that you could kind of conceivably make a case for. My sense is that Ole Miss and LSU are in the second tier. You had your Georgia, Texas. The problem is, I think the obvious part of that tier is Alabama. It would normally be the obvious part of that tier. And I think there's some hesitation by me and others on whether Alabama with a new coach should be at that tier. That next tier, I think a lot of people are comfortable saying, oh, it's Ole Miss, and then maybe list a couple more. I think LSU is in the Ole Miss tier. So I don't know if that really directly answers your question. I think they both could be contenders to get to the SEC championship game, but I don't necessarily view them in the very top tier along with Georgia and Texas.
No, I agree. I'd put Missouri and Tennessee right there with LSU and Ole Miss and put them in a group, and that's kind of how I would look at it. Since you cover the sport nationally and you kind of get to parachute into an event like this and kind of see the coaches, now you covered the game a long time, but what is sort of different about SEC coaches in this conference relative to your experiences with other coaches in other conferences?
So I think the SEC in general, and again, we're talking very, very general because I just got out of, a session with Eli Drinkwitz, and he's definitely a pretty open personality. You can see that Eli makes an effort to show his personality. I think Eli understands the program he's at. I think it's also part of his nature to show his personality. I do think SEC coaches, in a profession that tends to be very guarded, I think SEC coaches are among the most guarded because the hyper-competitiveness of the conference, I think, leads them all to be a little bit like, you know what, we have to mind our P's and Q's here. There's also an element that relates to media coverage, quite frankly. I think SEC coaches are used to sort of being in the spotlight, very intense scrutiny, so I think that they tend to learn to be careful about what they say.
All right, championship pick. Who you got on your ballot?
All right, I'm gonna put Georgia. I'm gonna go very kind of bland here and go Georgia and Texas, with Georgia winning the conference. I do think that like Kirby's in a good. I'm far less confident with Texas. I do think Kirby's in a great situation here because he has both the loaded roster and the coaching continuity that a lot of other. That combination I don't think exists with the rest of the league. I can pick holes where the rest of the league is missing a little of one or the other, whereas Georgia, especially coming off of last year's disappointment not making the playoff, I think should be loaded to be a cut above, even in a great conference as good as it is this year.
Thanks, Ralph.
Thanks, guys.
There you have it, Ralph Russo, AP. All right, Zach. By the way, how about this? Let me do this first. And I have not told you this. I got a great tease for Monday because Titans camp's coming. I had dinner last night with someone who was able to tell me a host of Mike Vrabel stories.
Wow.
Somebody who was very close with him on the professional level when he was a player and a coach. We will have some fun with that coming up next week. So that's your if you've been here, if you're this far into the show and you're a Titans fan, there's your nugget for next week. Okay, so I want you to tell me who's your championship. If you're filling out the ballot right now, who's on your ballot 1 and 2? I just want to know championship game first.
I mean, it's bland, and I agree with him, and I agree with most everybody. It's kind of the reluctant 1 and 2. I do think it's going to be Georgia and Texas. I just think the way the schedules work out, I think the coach. I think those are the two best SEC coaches currently. And I think that says a lot because I really do think that Sark is really become one of the better coaches in the SEC in all of college football.
Yep.
And I think Kalen DeBoer and Lane Kiffin and these other guys are like right there. They're right underneath him. But I think that clear as day, coaching staff, talent at the quarterback position, which is probably still the most important position out of everything here. Even though I'm not a big Quinn Ewers guy as far as the NFL is concerned, if he fails or flounders, they still have Arch Manning behind him there and all that. I like their defensive line rotation there as well sometimes, and their offensive line is really good. And so you got the trenches, the quarterback, all this stuff. Alabama is like right on the outset. Like it's really hard for me to put Alabama in the top 2 though, because Alabama's like it's proof. You got to see proof of concept in my mind with Alabama. So it's just right there, and it really hurts to put Texas ahead. But I think I'm going to, if I were gun in my head, I would say Georgia and Texas.
I have Georgia and Alabama. I think Alabama's being undervalued. In Athlon Sports, our magazine, we've got them at 4 in the conference. I think they're probably going to be 3 or 4 in the media. I think the questions about Kalen DeBoer and Alabama are more longer-term questions. What made Saban great was 4 championships in 10 years. How do you evolve? How do you adapt? How do you take risks? How do you do like evaluate rosters and manage people and a giant moving cruise ship that is Alabama football? All of that's big picture stuff. And all of those questions, I think, are totally fair about Kalen DeBoer. But I think in the short term, Alabama is going to be better on offense than they were last year. I think Milroe's better. I think the offensive line is better. I think the running game is going to be more creative and more dynamic. Kalen DeBoer has a track record of maximizing his quarterbacks every step he's ever been. I think Alabama's talking to Jalen Milroe yesterday. Alabama is pissed off that they were this close. Milroe is an exceptional young person. He's getting his master's degree. He immediately started off admitting like, hey, I should have watched one more rep. I should have done one more rep in practice. I should have watched one more thing of film. It is eating at him. They lost in the Rose Bowl and were that close to the championship game. And I think, and then the change of coaching, he said it, and you can check out both the YouTube page and the Instagram feed for the clip where he's like, when Kalen DeBoer left and the people that stayed, we got closer because of it. I mean, when Nick Saban left and Kalen DeBoer showed up, some people left, some people stayed. We are now a tighter knit group because of that, facing that sort of adversity. So I just think you look at their schedule, Missouri, big game, Auburn, a big game. Both of them are at home. Georgia's a big game. That's at home. At LSU could be dangerous. I'm not as worried about the Oklahoma road trip and Tennessee. So they've got a tough schedule. But if they go 5-2 in that stretch, they're probably in the SEC championship game. Here's what I would think happens with Georgia. They split. If they play twice, I think they split. The question is, which one do they win? and I don't know that. But I think Alabama's a little underrated. I do think the top three are clear. That it is Alabama, Georgia, Texas. And if any order you want to pick is fine with me. I think those are the best three rosters. I think, to your point, it's at least two of the best coaches. I think Brian Kelly's coaching staff might be the best in the entire conference outside of Kirby Smart.
Yeah, it's probably the best staff. I would agree with that.
And so I think, and I said this to Ralph, I said it to Caroline, I think there are four teams on the next tier, LSU, Tennessee, Missouri, and Ole Miss, that I think are competing for one, maybe two playoff spots. It's probably four teams for one spot, which is going to make it really fun. My order, and it took me a long time to – I went Ole Miss 4, I went Tennessee 5, I went Missouri 6, I went LSU 7, and then I'm tempted to put A&M in that group at 8, and then I have Oklahoma at 9. And that is my top 9 in order. And that's the ballot I filled out today. But I honestly, any of the top 3 combination, not surprised. Any of those next 4 or 5 in any combination, don't have a problem with it. So I don't know who you agree on the top 3, and we can spend a little bit more time on this later on in the summer, but I'm just curious if you're filling out a ballot, Ole Miss, Missouri, LSU, Tennessee, who do you like the most out of that group?
I would go Ole Miss, Missouri, Tennessee, LSU.
Okay, that's pretty close.
And I think we are probably a lot closer in our opinions of the SEC this year than probably if you went and found someone else in the lobby. They'd probably have an entirely different array of where it's at. But I kind of agree with you. Like, I got to see Alabama's defense. That to me is a big question mark, as not only as an analyst but as a fan. Is like, I want to see. They lost a lot of corners. And I know they got guys that are coming in and all this stuff, but sometimes you just got to see it to really believe it. Whereas with Texas, that defensive line rotation is going to be very good.
I don't know. That's my concern about Texas. And this is what's interesting.
See, that's not my concern, because they do this hockey, style rotating in and out. And there's still a lot of guys from last year that are going to be rotating in and out with new guys this year. So like, I don't have that big of a question mark. I mean, they lost 2 really good players, but I think they're going to have 2 really good players. Like,
so what's interesting?
Where I'm at with Texas.
What I'm finding really interesting in this conversation is if you're going to ask a major question about any of these teams outside of Georgia, what was the worst part of Texas' team last year? Secondary. To me, what's the biggest question? Losing Murphy and Sweat along with the secondary. Missouri, they lost their defensive coordinator, 2 corners to the NFL, a middle linebacker, and a pass rusher to the NFL. So what's their offense is elite? What's the question? Defense. LSU, trust Nussmeier, trust the best offensive line in America. What's going to be the problem? Defense. Tennessee, what's the problem? Secondary, back 7, defense. You just mentioned Alabama. If you're going to raise a question, it's probably some of the defensive pieces, although I trust their roster and they're going to be pretty good.
Right.
Keep going. Like,
but you want to see it because it's a new coach. I
yes,
mean, it's just
absolutely.
It's just all new, and I think that's the big worry that I have with Caleb. I don't have a worry, but like if I had one big concern going into Alabama is that I'm not worried about the offense, but I am worried about the defense. But I really do think that Jalen Milroe takes the next step. But is that defense good enough? Like, does the defense come together, and is it good enough to stop an opposing team's really good quarterback?
Yeah. If you were to say, like, if you were to use a broad generalization about teams and say, man, I'm really not worried about the offense. I think they're going to score a bunch of points, but I have a few questions about the defense. If you just use that really vague general sentence.
You could describe like 10 teams in SEC.
That's Texas. That's Alabama. That's Tennessee. That's LSU. That's Missouri. That's maybe Ole Miss. I mean, the only 2 that are kind of the opposite are A&M and Oklahoma. Like, really good defensive lines, really good defensive fronts, questions about the offensive line and the quarterbacks. Like, this is what I'm saying. Like, we started the show with great quarterback play. It's all about which defense comes along fastest. That is going to be the question.
Who
and
gets
which
that one necessary stop?
Bingo. It's literally going to come down to a drive. It's going to come down to a drive. So we've got a lot more college football talk coming up. We got Titans camp coming up, Sinkers Beverages and the Kingston Group. Of course, make sure you check out our great local and amazing sponsor. All of our coverage here from SEC Media Days brought to you by Sinkers Beverages and the Kingston Group Bluegrass Beverages up in Hendersonville as well. Zach, you got stackintheinbox.com. We got Lower Broad Hockey on Substack. Lots of stuff happening in the Preds world right now. You got Club and Country covering the soccer club, of course, with the new coach, and all the other great shows across the network. Paul Karski podcast, Hot Read podcast, Music City Audible, Football and Other F Words. And, of course, remember, Sinkers Beverages, Kingston Group, Bluegrass Beverages. We do appreciate all you guys. Thanks to Caroline Fenton, Josh Ward, Seth Emerson, Ralph Russo. We had a bunch of folks on Monday hanging out as well. Appreciate seeing all you guys and all of them coming on the show. So other than that, Zach, where can people find you?
StackingInbox.com and on Twitter @FWordsPod.
Happy birthday, Zach.
Thank you.
There you go. All right. Thank you guys all for listening. Thanks for hanging out. I'm about to go jump on a plane and head on back to Nashville to my children, my wife, my bed, and my dog. And I can't wait. I can't wait. For Zach, I am Braden. Thank you all for listening. Sinkers Beverages, everybody. We will talk to you guys on Monday.